Talking Auburn football and in the deep south where college football is king, and in East Alabama where Auburn University resides, the battle cry is War Eagle. Once again, it's K2 to go for Vernon Speak Sports. We want the comment section to be active. We get a lot of information from the comment section. Want to give a shout out to my fearless and true gang. We got a lot of moving parts here in this off season. Florida is actually struggling right now with all of the decommits because of the recent developments down there. But that has nothing to do with Auburn football. Just want to make mention of that. Dan Mullen will need to put the pieces back together. We're talking Auburn sports also. We want to talk more so about the offensive line for the Auburn Tigers that has been getting a lot of press during the season and off season as well. A lot of people like to detract and say that the Auburn offensive line was part of the anemia of the offensive line from this last year. So when we look at the chronology of how we got to this point, we have to look at the fact that Herb Hand departs from Auburn in 2017, goes to Texas. In comes J.B. Grimes to try to piece together a very inexperienced offensive line for the Auburn Tigers. And when you look at the offensive line and most of their struggle, it predicates at the interior point of the offensive line. Now, when you look at the offensive line, for example, most of the breakdowns happen dead in the center. When you talk about a run-pass option, the center position is the most difficult position on the field because that has to be the most athletic guy on the offensive line because he has to take the snap. Then he has to usually, have to block the most physical, the biggest defensive threat on the defensive line for the opposing team, which didn't always bode well for the Auburn Tigers. You look at the output last year, Auburn at a certain point, especially the Mississippi State game, was ranked among the lowest in third down conversions. That told on the Auburn Tigers, especially in the rigors of the SEC. Also, you could see on a lot of occasions where Jarrett Stidham was running for his life in a lot of occasions, and it's usually dead up the middle. So one of the things that the Auburn Tigers will have to fix is the center position, because when you talk about a run-pass option, things will get very disruptive right at the point of attack in the middle of the field because you have with the run pass option, you usually start out with a fake to the tailback, then the progression starts from there. And if you don't have a strong center in place, then a lot of dangerous things can happen, especially when you talk about the defensive scheme of Andy Avalos, as he's going to try to put a lot of pressure on the quarterback, and you can best believe he's going to be zeroing in at the weaknesses at the center position, which was pretty much the most weak position for Auburn last year. Of course, you got Kim Caleb, who has taken on that starter role. Troxell, who was also a reserve offensive guard, he is now out for the season with an ACL injury. So when we look at this, what happened to the Auburn Tigers? Well, one, you have a largely inexperienced staff you have at the offensive line position. Many departures from the 2017 season left Auburn having to piece the offensive line together, not having a true center in this position, which led to somewhat of a debacle at times for the Auburn Tigers. And if you look at the stretch between, Mississippi State and Alabama, things started to get real rocky for the offensive line. Could not convert on third down, did not have a 1,000-yard rusher. So it made things a lot difficult for this offensive staff. Now, that's not to say that the offensive line was totally at fault. They did not help the situation. But when you talk about the things schematically, you talk about blocking for a run-pass option scheme where the run-pass option was not going to necessarily happen because Jarrett Stidham was not a run-pass option quarterback. He did not scare any defense with the threat to run the football. So you're blocking for a scheme that the defense is really not going to be fooled by. So that's going to put a lot of pressure on the defense. Put a lot of pressure on the offensive line. Also, Chip Lindsey's version of play calling just did not bode well for the Auburn Tigers because, you have bubble screens that, work sometimes, didn't work the next play, just very inconsistent play calling when you have wildcat situations where you're very desperately trying to get 2 or 3 yards when these guys actually showed as an offensive line when you line them up and you block downhill, these guys actually weren't that bad. But when you're trying to, design elaborate, developing schemes for these guys, it just didn't work. When the play was slow to develop, that's when you started to see the struggle mostly in the offensive line. But when it was an attack type mode, this offensive line really wasn't that bad. But when you have plays like the jet sweep, especially the longer developing jet sweeps in the Chip Lindsey play calling schematics, it just didn't bode well for this particular offensive line. This offensive line was the most effective when things were quick, when you had quick strikes, when you had, jet sweeps that were kind of closer to the line of scrimmage, didn't take as long to develop. So I'll say this, the offensive line was somewhat of a liability for the Auburn Tigers, but the whole scheme period last year from 2018 was a huge liability for the Auburn Tigers because you have a pro-style quarterback impersonating a dual threat quarterback. You're impersonating a run-pass option offense for an offensive line who's having to block for a run-pass option that's not going to happen. Okay, so that's where the liability lied with the Auburn Tigers. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the center position for the Auburn Tigers here in the offseason has to be fixed. Because if you don't have a good center in this offense, it's just not going to work very well. Right now, J.B. Grimes says that Kim Horton is the guy. Kim Caleb is the guy at the center position. Hopefully he has developed. He came in as a offensive guard. The center position in college football is not an easy position to play, and that's where things begin and end for the offensive line. So when we look going forward in the 2019 season, you look at a situation where, you're either going to have Bo Nix or Joey Gatewood as the quarterback. You're going to have viable dual threat options. The offensive line is going to be blocking for a scheme that they're actually going to be able to execute because the quarterback can run. Jarrett Stidham was not trying to run the football. I remember that Mississippi State game, you have Jarrett Stidham rolling out. I could tell that was part of the game plan, rolling out to create more time with the passing game, but, receivers were just not getting open. Okay, so when we look at this moving forward, it's definitely something that, is going to be a subject. How will the offensive line respond in 2019 versus 2018? That's up for debate. I think, if the Purdue game was any indication, the offensive line played much better. They were much more confident because you could tell in that Mississippi State game, they were absolutely dejected. When you have media pretty much telling you these guys have access to social media and the media at large, and you're constantly being told over and over again that you are the cause of the problem, that's going to affect you psychologically. And I think that improved down the stretch for the Auburn Tigers. All right, guys, leave in the comment section. The offensive line position is a very complex entity of the football game. Go ahead and leave in the comment section what you think about where the offensive line could possibly improve for the Auburn Tigers. Once again, it's K2 to go for Vernon Speak Sports. We're talking Auburn football like nobody else will. Go ahead and comment. Go ahead and like this particular video. And importantly, go ahead and subscribe to Vernon Speak Sports Auburn War Eagle.